This is a video of a speech by David Starkey. Let me read the introduction so we can gently ease into the topic that he is discussing, which is to do with the situation in Ukraine. The title of this New Culture Forum video is "Ukrainians Aren't Like Us. We'd never defend Britain so bravely. Conservatives must take note." The description begins. Dr. David Starkey argues that the brave Ukrainians aren't fighting for mythical Western EU ideas and values of universal human rights, etc. Instead, they are fighting for something almost primal: half home, family, and country, the land itself. Fighting to defend one's country is something we in Britain would once have also done without hesitation. Yet who amongst us can honestly say they would expect today's British Army or Navy to act as bravely as those Ukrainians on Snake Island who refused to surrender to a Russian warship, telling the warship to go fuck yourself before being blown up? We don't know how true it is, but let's assume it is. The next paragraph begins. Starkey argues that conservatism has to be rooted in country and in the history and tradition of the country. Putin understands this. The Ukrainians understand this. Concepts of universal human rights, universal values, the international community, etc. are myths. They don't exist other than in the minds of certain Western liberals. Values are unique to each country. These are difficult words. When you talk about values, surely we ought to have values. What David Starkey, I think, is saying is that he doesn't approve of all this universal values thing of liberals. And he's basically talking about ethnocentrism because in a part of his speech, he speaks approvingly of the Ukrainians forbidding Ukrainian children of learning another language. I'm not quite clear about this, but obviously the values he is against is universal values. But I'm thinking of the eternal and universal values of the no-hide laws. And I think they are, on the one hand, rigid enough for us to know exactly what they are, while allowing us in our own countries, in our own way, to interpret them. In the same way that I would argue it is possible for each of the 50 United States, if asked to interpret the Quran for themselves, will produce their own unique version that would be different to the others. And this is why I particularly favour this book, because it has that flexibility. I don't think people really know how superbly flexible it is. So on the one hand, you could use the Quran for just a tribe or an ethno-state, or you could use it to govern an empire. And there is no other moral system in Scripture that has the intention and capacity to do this. I'm not really joking when I talk about, secular Quranism with Israeli characteristics, because obviously the Israelis, if they ever adopted it, would be interpreting it in their own way. And I certainly don't want to tell anyone in any country how exactly to interpret it, although I have a few suggestions myself, but I know I won't control the interpretation. Who can, even if I were dictator? Because, well, after my death, that people would want to interpret it in a slightly different way. However much I made them promise and enshrine in the Constitution that they have to do it my way, if it was wrong and if it didn't work, it would be soon thrown out. Rather like Akhenaten's deity Aten, when he sought to move the Egyptians from a pantheon of Egyptian deities to just a sun disk. It really didn't take hold at all in the time of Akhenaten, because although he had the power to force the priesthood into retreat, the moment he died, they just changed everything back again. So even somebody with who had complete totalitarian power over everyone has the limitation of not being immortal. But let us try and understand what David Starkey is trying to say. He is talking about blood and soil and the unique characteristics of any nation. For land, you would in some way have to absorb the picture in your mind's eye that you would have of your land, the land in which you live, be it mountainous or an island or rolling fields or whatever it is that is geographically unique to your country. So your perception of the land is of its landscape. I know not everyone lives in the country, but there should be something special about the architecture of the land that would make you think, yes, I know it. This can only be London or York or Oxford or Bath or whatever that is, architecturally unique to where you are. And that is why so many people want to live in cities that are known for their peculiar cityscape, such as the Eiffel Tower for Paris and the Tower of London for London, or St Paul's, or whatever you think is peculiarly London, the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, the memory that a tourist would leave the country with. And so we are talking about the unique characteristics of a country that would make its denizens be able to picture in their mind's eye. So that, of course, would be unique to that country. But in terms of universal values, the values that he is decrying would be those liberal values that make everyone the same, which is objectionable to our sense of pride and uniqueness. As individuals, we would not want our names to be taken away and be replaced with a number. Let me play you the bit where he begins his speech that I think is relevant.
I think I am right in saying, again, we carefully assess what the nature of the Ukraine is, because we're all on their side. But it's not exactly a liberal country, as I understand it. The educational policies deny ethnic minorities the opportunity to be taught in their own languages beyond the age of 9. Right? This is a reassertion and an imposition of a specific form of ethnic identity. These are deeply uncomfortable thoughts, aren't they? What we've got to address, it seems to me, is their sense of rootedness in their country, their sense of rootedness, don't use the word, in their race, their people, their sense of rootedness in their history. And these are very difficult questions, but I think they touch us profoundly, because it's appropriate. We've got the bust of Roger Scruton here. A conservatism has fundamentally, this is our terrible problem, a conservatism has fundamentally to be rooted in history and in the tradition of a country. It cannot be rooted in anything else. Roger and others tried to begin with to have a kind of universal conservatism that was rooted essentially in theology, in God as the idea and the origin of values. That will not work. What we've got to recognize is, as the Ukrainians do, there are no such things as universal values. There is no such thing as international law. There is no such thing as universal human rights. There are things which are specific to nations. Disraeli says it better than anybody else. A Conservative party that is not a national party is nothing. We have to re-confront this. We have to re-understand it. And the only way you can now be a national party is with a particular address and understanding and comprehension of the history of your country. And of course, we are uniquely fortunate. Again, we must all have had that sense of, dare I say, English exceptions, British exceptions, it's really English, looking at those horrors of Eastern Europe and thinking that the last time there was anything comparable in England is a civil war in the 17th century. There is English exceptionalism. We have had a society which is capable of a history which reconciles. Look around here. You have Charles I, a statue of him at the top of Whitehall, where the traffic was stopped when I tried to get here. And at the other end, you've got the statue of the man who executed him. You've got Cromwell. That sense of a history that can reconcile, that can hold together, that can encompass. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to learn from the Ukraine. We need, once again, to understand this universalism simply does not work. A conservative cannot believe in universal values. Values are specific to a culture. Again, everybody talks as though there is a world community. That world that believes in rules is effectively Europe and the Anglosphere. 20% only of countries are democratic. Today, Pakistan actually signs an agreement with Putin. Actually signs an agreement. In other words, we're deluded when we think that there is this, this international world order, the vital importance of the United Nations, the infinite absurdity of talking of summoning Putin before the International Court of Justice. All of this is the merest utter unreality. If we are to survive as a nation, and I use that word very seriously, we have once again to address this question of belonging, identity, and nationhood, and an understanding, a welcoming and comprehension of our history. And we've got to realize there are people who are real enemies of it. There is no doubt whatever that the whole of the BLM, the whole of critical race theory has a single purpose. It is to delegitimate that history, which is the only basis for the existence of our society. Not for nothing is the Palace of Westminster built in the Gothic style. It's there to say we do not owe our history, we do not owe our freedoms to a specific moment of constitutional creation. It's saying those freedoms are intrinsic, they are immemorial, they have always been here. It's a myth, but it's not a very big myth, since literally those freedoms, literally our political structure, literally the use of that building as the world's mother of parliament, principal representative assembly, does go back to Magna Carta. We have to understand this, we have to use it, we have to propagandize it, and we have to tell people, if we don't, we will fall. We will not do what the Ukrainians have done. We will not have that courage. We will not show that heroism. There has to be, finally, as Roger, better than anybody else said, the foundation of political trust, the foundation of political alignment is not rational. It is irrational. It is a product of where you're born, the culture into which you were born. No sillier phrase has ever been written, as I always say, all bad ideas are French, but no sillier phrase has ever been written than that of Rousseau, man is born free. He's not. He's not. Think of Augustine. You're born, it's piss and shit. You are absolutely helpless. You are dependent for years. You are a creature of your parents, all of those things that are listed by Macaulay there. The place you're born, the mother who rears you, the woman you love, and so on. You're a product of all of those things. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do think we've got a lot of lessons to learn from what's happening in the Ukraine. We've also got to learn the lessons that the world isn't safe, that there isn't a world order to which we can appeal. We've got to learn above all the lessons that other people have different values from us. And finally, and again, as conservatives, we should be willing to recognize this, no state can survive that can't defend itself. And the erosion of our armed forces, the rendering of ourselves utterly vulnerable in terms of fuel and so on, is an act of folly that seems to me to be unforgivable. I'm not going to go back and recite dear old Macaulay again, but that sense of the man on the bridge, attached to his country, to his place, not to some vast system of universal values, recognizing he's different, not better, simply different. We as conservatives essentially have to depend on that specificity, that rootedness, that sense of place, of history, and of time.
Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel,
did you find it a little confusing? I think it was a little bit. It made me think, though, of something called integralism, which is actually a Catholic idea. Let me read it for you, because, okay, before I read for you, I'll tell you what I think it means. I may have got it wrong. But integralism is basically the idea of building on the history and traditions of your country and, just developing whatever it was and, making it special to your national narrative. So it begins in this Wikipedia entry: integralism. In politics, integralism is the principle that the Catholic faith should be the basis of public law and public policy within civil society, wherever the preponderance of Catholics within that society makes this possible. It's a lot of Catholic stuff, but okay, that's I shouldn't have read that, really, sorry about that. because there's sort of so many layers of meaning to it. And I will read the one in the third paragraph, the Wikipedia entry, which is more relevant to what I had in mind. The term is sometimes used more loosely to refer to a set of theoretical concepts and practical policies that advocate a fully integrated social and political order based on a comprehensive doctrine of human nature. In this generic sense, some forms of integralism are focused purely on achieving political and social integration, others national or ethnic unity, while others were more focused on achieving religious and cultural uniformity. Integralism has thus also been used to describe non-Catholic religious movements such as Protestant fundamentalism or Islamism. In the political and social history of the 19th and 20th centuries, the term integralism was often applied to traditionalist conservatism and similar political movements on the right wing of the political spectrum, but it was also adopted by various centrist movements as a tool of political, national, and cultural integration. The generic concept would cover many philosophies across the political spectrum from left to right. Professed integralists in the narrow sense generally reject the left-right dichotomy. So I think what I've just read does suggest that you just make, the most of what you have in terms of culture and society, and just build on that, and this will give you your unique national narrative. And David Starkey is basically saying that the British would only fight for Britain if they felt that their country was special. Oh, is this completely necessary? Well, I think people will just defend their territory anyway, because it's like if you have nowhere to go, well, you do have a duty to defend, your country, your property. I think it's instinctive. It doesn't have to, you have all these sort of, special uniquenesses of your territory imbued, but obviously it would help, obviously you're going to fight for your country more if you feel your ancestors have inhabited it for a long time. But I think you will find that people who've just arrived are prepared to fight wars in order to gain social acceptance. I was just reading yesterday about the American-Spanish War, that the blacks wanted to fight the Spanish because they wanted to prove themselves and make themselves worthy of the freed status that they enjoyed after the American Civil War. So really, you don't need that much to get people to fight. You just need the cooperation of the Fourth Estate. Now, in terms of secular Quranism, what can be made to fit in to what the different European countries I have in mind who would want to adopt it? And I think they all have, in a way, the necessary narrative to want to reject matriarchy and globo homo and their previous Christian identity, because all these Western countries who are part of Christendom obviously have the same problem, which is why they're all going wrong at the same time. So we have, in the West, very silly people in charge. And they have not enjoyed the confidence of the people for decades. It didn't happen suddenly, because we know what people said when they when they had Trump to vote for. So one of the stories that I do particularly remember hearing from America is that Americans had actually not bothered voting for 20 years. And it was only when Trump came along that they suddenly thought they had something to vote for. They finally heard somebody saying something they liked. This is, of course, not recorded in mainstream media, which unfortunately will be the official record that will tell our story of our times to future generations. And I think this is a matter of honour, not to be tarred with the same brush. I really hate the idea of my time living in this society being presented as something from the Guardian or the Independent or any of those newspapers that have these assumptions that I do not share about having a certain worldview, which I certainly do dissent from, but I do realise that my view is the minority view. The view of a minority within a minority within a minority. And I think it's only a sense of honour that would make you want to fight against this. I just don't want anybody thinking that I went along with this and didn't protest. And so the motive for me to protest against this objectionable narrative is to vocally and repeatedly reject it. And I think all challenges to anything needs to come from a sound argument with which to base your action on. I don't think we need to have any particular identity, because at the moment the identity is not an attractive one. We have the identity of having the worst leaders in the world, particularly in Europe. I mean, the Americans can say, we told the Europeans to do that. We didn't expect them to be so stupid as to actually do it and destroy themselves. So this is more a matter for Europeans to slough off this terrible oppressive reputation of being the poodles of America. We are led by poodles of America. These mindless neocons who obviously know on which side of their bread is buttered. That's why they keep voting for war. We know about John McDonnell tonight, who he was supposed to go to this anti-war meeting and anti-war rally, and he was threatened with having the whip withdrawn, and he said, all right, I won't go anymore. I won't go then. So Keir Starmer got his way, and I think you'll find that all the posh, educated leaders of the Labour Party would be neocon. I mean, this is a systemic problem that the educated middle-class men of Britain, in fact, have no principles. They were never taught any, because it never occurred to their public schools to teach them anything of the sort. So these public school boys have the enviable quality of having high social status, and because of their parents' ability to pay for their education, and therefore to lose this status would be the most terrible thing, and therefore all their efforts about seeking status would be to maintain that status at any cost. And since they were not taught any principles, they don't have any. And whatever moral sense these people have would be very basic, like, well, I mustn't murder, I mustn't steal, I mustn't lie. Or make fraudulent representations. But perhaps it is all about maybe doing those things but not getting caught. And what David Starkey said about these things not being theological, it's still a little puzzling to me. I might go back and listen to it. But I'm saying it has to be theological because, well, he's working on the assumption that we have this unique idea, or what I'm trying to say, people on a particular land who fight for their country would have a sense of identity. And that identity would be something to do with their location, living in a defined piece of territory and having a peculiar identity. But the Ukraine is actually the worst example because we know of its peculiarities and its separatism. So, there are these Russians in the east, and then you have these Ukrainians to the west, and they look west, and the Russians look east, and it's already divided. And they're all Christian. We're not saying they're not Christian, but you see, even the religion of Christianity is not able to hold these white people together. And I think David Starkey is missing something when he doesn't get that. And when he talks about the heroics of the Ukrainians, well, we don't know how much of it is actually true. It could be all just made up, war heroics that didn't even happen. But in order for anyone to fight for anything, you must weave a narrative of why they might be fighting this thing and what they might get if they succeed. So in the case of the blacks in the Spanish-American War, it was obvious what they did. I mean, a lot of people fight because they want the payback after the successful war. Like, if we fight your war, you'll give us a certain privilege after the war is successfully fought. You will, give us land or something of the nature. So what we need is an idea to fight for. And this idea has to be based on a narrative. Why are we fighting? Because something's not to our satisfaction. So if you look at the American revolutions, the American revolutionists would say, well, we didn't like the idea of taxation without representation. And the French revolutionaries would say, well, we didn't like the idea of being taxed. And the burden of taxation falling on us alone, when it was the military and the king who incurred such a lot of debt in order to try and put a spanner in the works of the British. And what do we get? Nothing except higher taxes and I think they were suffering from the after effects of a famine or something. So that was the idea of the French revolutionaries. And as for the Russians, they were basically rebelling against bad government. So we already have this narrative. And it has been woven. We will be getting higher prices and higher energy costs, and our political classes will not be able to explain it to our satisfaction. They won't be able to say why they're doing it, because the reason why they're doing it is because that's not what they've always done. They would always vote for war because of their share portfolio, probably. They all have, lots of shares in the defense industries. And this the media won't acknowledge. But because of the censorship and the lies that have been told to us for so long now, we are most of us very skeptical of what the media says. So what would we be fighting for if we did fight? I mean, bearing in mind that we are not young revolutionaries. We are really fighting for the principle of the thing. We are fighting for, well, the right not to be governed by the worst people using a failing system and really the problem is that the morals of our leaders are completely unregulated. Not a single one of them is a believing Christian. They only pretend to be Christian to make themselves seem more moral to us. But we are wise to that. We know Boris has no principles. We don't know. And the ones of them who do, they're not very bright. Why do we have such egregiously incompetent and corrupt politicians? It's because of the system of representative democracy itself. Now, the narrative that we could weave is that, well, everything that we did wrong was because we didn't follow the Quran. Well, that would be my narrative, because I'm a secular Quranist. So if we're going to blame it on the Americans, we'd have to say, well, the Europeans fought two fratricidal world wars amongst themselves and then exhausted themselves, with the consequence that America had the global empire of Britain handed to them on a plate. And so the Europeans lost their imperial hegemony, their European hegemony, and power shifted from Europe to America. And what they should really learn a lesson from that, right? But they haven't. They're still stupid, and the Americans basically, treats them like poodles, and like yapping poodles, they would do things that didn't result in the promoting of their own national interest. And what could be worse than starting another European war over the Ukraine? It's almost inexplicably stupid. I mean, it can only be explained by incompetence and negligence and neurosis and what empty-mindedness. I mean, what are we dealing with? We have politicians that are are really children in a sweet shop. They can't help themselves but eat too many sweets until they are sick. And then, maybe vomit all over the shop floor. I don't know. But basically, the narrative would be that we object to this kind of government. We object to these laws that are being imposed on us because they do not make sense and they do not create a sustainable future fit for any children of ours, if we have any, or children of the children of our children or our descendants. What will they think of us? What will they think of us? And so what I propose is really a dipping of the toes into questioning the political order. And this can only take the form of, verbal action in questioning the whole political order. And I suppose many of you are not particularly experienced in talking about these things. I find a lot of people don't really like talking about politics because they're not even sure about the most basic things, or things that I think are basic, and they go all quiet because they don't know how to argue. But what I suggest to you is to frame every point you want to make, not in a political speech, but in a question, a simple question that is immediately understood, that might not be answered, but will nag at the person that you are addressing. Joe, well, I'm glad you're listening to me so carefully. I think I did doze off, I'm afraid. What you were talking about, I did doze off. Sorry. Yeah, I wasn't checking anything, I did doze off. I nodded off. Angel in the Dots, what are you saying? Putin has already stated that this war is against radical nationalism. Yeah, well, nationalism. I thought he said he was talking about denazifying the Ukraine. I suppose Russia could be accused of revanchism, which is getting back territory that you've lost. But really, it's about Ukraine joining NATO, right? That's his red line that he said he wouldn't tolerate years ago. Oh, thank you, Rune. Right. Perhaps I shouldn't have got myself into what David Starkey was. Okay, I'm trying to make sense of what he was really saying, and he's basically saying, what is he saying? You know, he just reads bits here and there from heroic accounts of people dying on bridges and sacrificing their lives, and it's all very romantic and heroic. But for ordinary people who want to make a point without sacrificing their lives, we need to go. We need to be more practical and more thoughtful about what we can do in the difficult times ahead. And I think we can only say what we believe to be the truth to as many people that we dare say it to. And if we don't have any people that we trust enough, then I guess we are rather sad people. But I think the best thing we can do is try the limited objective of just persuading one person to our point of view. Can you do that? It's not that easy, but it is something that is sort of safe enough for you middle-aged elderly people who are not very adventurous and don't want to go to rallies and things like that. You don't want to catch COVID and die of it. So I think what we should do is make a point of talking to more people and get better at arguing. Yeah, get better at arguing. I can help with that. And yes, I guess that was what I was working up to. There's usually just a few, set topics about, what you need to say, and and a certain pattern to the discourse that is pretty predictable, and people should people should just sort of work out how it is done. And if you want advice, I'm very happy to help you. I mean, there's lots of clues already in the comments that you post and how I deal with them. And it's all about weaving the narrative and returning to particular principles. It is really the principles that kind of put you on the straight and narrow. Yeah. Maybe I haven't explained myself very well. I'm a little bit tired, but thank you for listening anyway.